Are we good? Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you all for being here. Thank you, Renata, for having this great panel. I have such a passion for this work. I spent most of my career doing this work. These type of conversations that we're going to have today are so needed. We absolutely have to continue to have them. The focus today is to look at how this panel is going to talk about what happened on May 25th, 2020, the day that George Floyd was murdered. The tragic murder of another Black man, innocent. It moved so many to action, and we're going to talk about how within their corporations and their organizations. So let me introduce you to our panel here. Angela Woods, Senior Director, Corporate Citizenship for ESPN.
Hi, everybody. Yay!
Miguel Santana, President and Chief Executive Officer for the Weingart Foundation.
Good afternoon, everyone.
Chaitali Mehta, Chief Operating Officer for the LA84 Foundation.
Woo!
And Brian Blake, Senior Director, Diversity and Inclusion for the NHL. First and foremost, thank you again for being here and for lending your time and your voice. I know some of you have traveled here, so thank you. So I want to start here. Where were you when you heard about the murder of George Floyd? And what went through your mind? At what point did you begin to ponder how might you respond within your organization?
I'll start. I remember I'm in Connecticut. ESPN's campus is based in Connecticut. I remember being in the office, and there was conversation around how we would integrate that story into some of the content of what was going on. As many of you know, if you watch our platform, which I hope you do in some fashion or form, linear TV, plus, whatever, it was a timely conversation, and some of the work that we had been doing around equity and communities of color and trying to figure out how we're going to weave that conversation into some of the coverage that was happening that day. Because obviously that night and events that followed impacted the NBA, where you saw boycotts of the NBA teams who stopped playing as a result of George Floyd's murder and other things. So I remember being on campus. As a person of color, my first thought was, not again, not another person. Instinctively, as a person of color, that came to mind. And then secondly, I think for me, what rang true was, is this going to finally be the pivotal moment where we start to have a conversation around the inequities that are happening and what we can collectively do as an organization, particularly in sports, and how can ESPN play a role to convene and galvanize conversations?
So I was in Pomona working at Fairplex, serving on the board of the Weingart Foundation before I became the CEO. But I was also chairing a committee called the Committee for Greater LA. It was a group of civic leaders who had come together literally days before the shutdown and decided to really do a deep dive analysis of how the pandemic was going to expose the inequities that have existed in Los Angeles prior to the pandemic. And the way we organize ourselves is that we would meet once a week over Zoom every Friday afternoon. And soon after the murder of George Floyd, it was very clear that our work had to center racial justice, and that the issue of race we had to fully embrace. We had to be honest about the Black experience here in Los Angeles, and we had to center all of our recommendations around ensuring racial justice for all Angelenos. And so it was a pivotal moment for me personally, and certainly for the work that we do.
Yeah, for us at the Dodgers Foundation, when when the news broke of George Floyd's murder, we did a few things that really helped kind of center us and guide us in the years that have followed. And so first and foremost was checking in on our colleagues and ensuring that they were okay. Of course, our CEO, Nicole Whiteman, is a Black woman, and so ensuring them and other colleagues were feeling okay and safe and had a space to react and share how they were feeling and how others and allies could support. Two, what was going to be our response? How, as a foundation with the backing of a huge global brand, are we going to respond to this both internally and externally? What was going to be our plan? And three, and these are not in order, is how are we going to respond and provide resources and support for the communities that we serve? Of course, the Black youth and families that we serve, but all of the communities that we serve in terms of being able to provide them resources to support and be allies in the community. And so that was kind of our action as we dealt with the personal emotions, but also knowing that our work was so even more important in that moment.
Yeah, I echo a lot of what was said already. At our league, it was stunning, and I had the same reaction that Angela had, just not again. And I remember the player stoppage, which was a big deal at the NHL, because the NHL is not known for doing things like this. And so when the players decided they wanted to stop playing for a couple of days, quickly galvanized resources behind that. I think the other thing was we absolutely invested time in making sure our people were okay. We had a series of town halls, which I facilitated, and just allowed people to just get things off their minds, and for the organization to sort of really be present and let people know that we're here to support. And then I think a major effect it had was it accelerated a lot of things that we were putting in place around diversity and inclusion, and really expanding how we interact with audiences and youth. So I think it really lit a fire for us to move a lot more quickly than we were previously.
That's interesting, because one of the other questions that we have here is, do you guys feel like it shocked the system to change? Did it give the changes that had previously been noted and discussed but slow to be implemented?
I'd say for the NHL, it was the latter. Mm-hmm. And so it galvanized us to move even more quickly. And there was a lot more of people, wanting to get involved and be supportive. So that was, there are a lot of things that come out of the legacy of George Floyd's death, murder. Thankfully, many of those positive. No. Unfortunately, he paid with his life, but many of those positive. And our investments in various programs that we had previously been a part of had increased. We saw increases in such things with partners and things of that nature. So it really accelerated things for us.
And I think from a corporate perspective, so we're owned by the Walt Disney Company. So at the time of George Floyd's passing, Walt Disney Company made an announcement around a DE&I initiative, multi-million-dollar funding that we were going to do over the next 5 years. So that sort of was an impetus for us. But also I think specific to ESPN, it allowed and opened up a channel of conversation with the leagues. Much of what we do is not just insular to what we talk about on our platforms, but to the league relationships that we have with all 5 professional leagues, right? So I think it allowed an entree into a conversation with the NHL, with the NBA, and all the leagues to talk about the issue and to talk about what they were looking to do from a league perspective, and how ESPN could not only be a convener and aggregator in that conversation, but how we could also amplify some of the efforts and tell the stories around them. So I do think it was an impetus, sort of twofold for us, both from a corporate perspective, but also from a media company perspective.
Yeah, I would chime in to share that. We also took that moment to really pause and reflect and know that our mission to ensure that every Angelino has an opportunity to thrive was something that we were just really digging in on and really using our work through a social justice lens to ensure that we were continuing to do the work on the ground, but what else could we be doing? What more could we be doing given our platform and who we are and the brand that we represent? There's always more that we can do. And so immediately one of the first steps that we took was we wanted to make sure that we were funding organizations on the ground that were doing the work, so partnering with the Liberty Hill Foundation and their California funders for Boys and Men of Color to ensure that we were supporting organizations on the ground doing the work with funds to the tune of now over $500,000. And then we also made sure that we made time and space to listen and learn. From the organizations on the ground doing the work, having listening sessions, and making sure that we were really understanding where we could be supportive and amplify the voices of the leaders on the ground and the folks on the ground that were actually doing the work throughout our communities. And so that was something that was just really important to us, to make sure that not only were we writing checks, but we were backing it up with active listening and support and amplifying those voices. And then of course using, again, access to our platforms and activations to be able to raise up the organizations, bring their message to the forefront as partners to ensure that folks knew that the work is happening, and how are we now then using our platform to allow organizations like a Brotherhood Crusade to get their message out even further, et cetera. So that was kind of our immediate approach outside of our day-to-day activity and work.
And for the Weingart Foundation, I think it brought clear focus on our commitment to racial justice and combating systemic racism and calling it out, being unapologetic about identifying it and articulating how it's formed. But the other thing for us is that it brought us to our own reckoning as an organization. So we're 70 years old as a foundation. We were founded by Ben Weingart, who amassed his wealth through development in Southern California. And we've never reconciled how redlining played a role in the wealth that we manage. And so what we intentionally did was bring an outside historian who her entire body of work has been in redlining in LA, and to be honest about in what ways has our own wealth contributed to the inequities, to the racial injustice in Southern California, and not for the purpose of not villainizing sort of our founder, but rather to remind us that this didn't just happen today, right? George Floyd represents centuries of racism in our country, and it's not foreign to us here as Angelenos. It's very much rooted in who we are and our own systems. And for us to be able to be honest about that, to talk about it, but also to commit us to this work, not just for the moment, but forever. Mm-hmm. And so that's what that moment and all of that focus has meant for us.
You know, I feel like I'm hearing, listen, we all learned a lot from this. The collaboration is so incredibly key. I think it was just a different time for all of us. I mean, we've all been doing this work, but it was a different time. We just had to shift quickly, but we all knew it was the right thing to do. So we'll shift a little bit here. So we all know that the mission of LA84 is play equity. So I've got to ask all of you this. How do your programs aim to create more equitable opportunities for play and sports in the community? I see you smiling.
Yeah, I'll take that
Chaitali.
one. Number of programs we have in place that we're really proud of. One of them is called Learn to Play, which is a youth program aimed at all youth, but in particular youth of color. And we've got about 25 of our 32 clubs that are involved, and it creates opportunities for youth of color to play and have access to the sport. One of the big things that we're constantly dealing with at the NHL is creating access for people. to be a part of the sport. Myself, growing up as a kid, I didn't grow up near any hockey rinks. But through our partnership with our clubs, we were able to provide a great deal more access. In Canada, we have something called First Shift, and all of the regions in Canada are involved. There's about 125,000 participants between those two programs, and many of which are kids of color. About 41% in Canada are female, so we're reaching female and girls as well. We have a new program we launched this year called NHL Street, which is essentially playing ball hockey. Another way that we're trying to create access and open up different ways for people to be involved in our sport. So we've launched it in Las Vegas, Nashville, I think Madison, Wisconsin was this month, and we've got 3 Canadian cities jumping on in the next 2 months. So we're going to do a pilot for this year and see how it goes. We're really excited about that. We have another program called Future Goals, which is really exposing students to STEM through hockey. So they learn about some really interesting things about the movement of the puck and kinetic energy and angles and things of that nature. And we've had so far about over 3 million students go through that program, and 56% of them identify as non-white. So we are engaged in a lot of things to create exposure, but also embracing cultural change, right? We want to make sure that our sport is as welcoming to as many different people as possible. So we're excited about our investments in that. We've invested about $25 million through our Industry Growth Fund, which is a fund that is funded by both the NHL and the Players Association. It funds programs like Future Goals. And over the last 5 years, we've pumped about $25 million into those programs. So our commitment is strong, and we're excited about what's to come.
Wow, that's great.
I think for us, about a year ago, or a little more than a year ago, as we had all gone through sort of the first cycle of first year of the COVID pandemic, we took a step back. And so we kind of baselined it and said we knew that for communities of color, primarily Black and brown communities, sports access and access to a safe space to play was already inadequate in communities of color, even before the pandemic started. And we know, based on some of the statistics that Aspen Institute and others have shared, that those same communities, sports access has been even exacerbated through the pandemic. And so part of our conversation a year or so ago was we realized coming out of this pandemic, whenever that is, on the outskirts of this, we knew that communities of color were going to be even further disadvantaged for their kids to play sports, because statistics showed primarily, I think it's 42% of Hispanic parents and 45% of African American parents do not expect their kids to return to formalized organized sports at the capacity or level they were playing at prior to COVID. And 55% of those African American parents know that in their communities where many of their kids were going to local resources, those resources now are either diminished or have closed since the pandemic. So we really started to have conversations internally with the leagues and others around what do we need to do to aggregate collectively as an industry to help address the disparities that will exist in these communities coming out of the pandemic, or as kids start to return to play sports. And that's when we started and announced last fall this fund that we created between us and Beyond Sport called the Return to Play Fund. And it's going to be set up to fund nonprofit organizations working primarily in communities of color, who are not just doing short-term work to engage kids to play, but really looking at long-term sustainable growth and success for these communities to ensure that they are funding in 3 primary areas that we're looking at. It's strategic and organizational strategic guidance that we're going to fund for some organizations who might find now that they're having to deal with mental health issues that they're not equipped to do. Are we going to enable them through funding to bring in experts to help them in this area? Where we're looking at areas of advocacy and working with organizations like the Play Equity Fund, and then infrastructure. So how do we go into these communities, meet these kids where they are to ensure that they do have safe spaces to play, the equipment to play, coaches to help with them. So for us, it really was taking sort of a rally cry, if you will, and creating this fund, going out to advertisers, sponsors, leagues to say, we need to address this collectively as a group, as an industry. How do we ensure that we are giving these kids back and ensuring that they have access to play sports in a meaningful way to them by setting this fund up?
And I would just build off of that, Angela, when you talked about meeting kids where they are and safe spaces to play. So the Los Angeles Dodgers Foundation, our recently rebranded Dodgers Dream Team program, is our sports-based youth development program that provides barrier-free, inclusive opportunity. And this year, we're for young people to play baseball and softball. And this year, we're going to be serving over 12,000 youth at 83 locations across the city. And so, for us to be able to, thank you, for us to be able to do that and meet young people where they are is so important. But not only are we providing them access to play, we're also providing education and health resources as well. And critical, and a theme that I think we all heard throughout the day, and also providing trained coaches to support the young people. As we know, again, speaking to the mental health traumas that all of our young people have been experiencing, having trained empathetic, caring coaches and adult mentors in their life is so critical. And so that's something that we've made a critical component of our programming as well. And then speaking to safe spaces to play, over the last 2 years, we've completed 7 new or refurbished Dodgers Dream Fields, which are our baseball and softball fields throughout the community. Again, focusing on communities of color and making sure that we have these safe spaces to play. So we completed 7 fields for a total of 58, on track to our goal of 75 fields in the coming years as well too. And so making sure that that work has never stopped, and ensuring that our goals to ensure girls, teens, and Black youth are participating in the sports, because we know that those groups are traditionally underrepresented in baseball and softball.
Well, that's great.
So as a foundation, we generally don't fund, specific athletic activity. But I think what the pandemic really brought us to think about, from the perspective of the community, how can we still advance systemic change around the idea of play equity? And so it was important for us to support the fund and to really be intentional about creating a larger conversation around how access to sport is as important as access to other basic services that our communities rely on. And in the same way, we're broadening our thinking to also think about other ways in which young people, particularly in communities of color, don't have access to, whether it's in the arts or other areas that other communities take for granted and have access to. But thinking about it not just programmatically, but systemically, and that's why the work of play equity is so important, is that it's not only advancing specific programs in neighborhoods, but it's pushing a bigger conversation to change it systemically for all kids. And there needs to be that kind of movement. And for us, we are about systems change, and so advancing a fund and a movement that is about changing it for everyone is an essential part of what our funding program is.
That's great. So many amazing things going on. And that brings me to another question is, do we think there's more work to do? What can we do? How do we do it?
There's always more work to do, right? There's never enough resources, unfortunately, to meet the demands, not to spread gloom or anything like that. But obviously, I think there's always going to be more work to do. I think we have an opportunity as an industry across the media landscape, across the leagues and all of the other relationships to collaborate. I think you make meaningful change through collaboration. You make much more long-term sustainable scale through collaboration. So I think we have an opportunity that if we're all willing to sort of come together, that we can address and make real systemic change within this country. But we need to do some of that together in a way that's synergistic to each of our brands or each of our companies.
Love that.
Yeah, I'd agree with that. I think collaboration's key. I think at the NHL in particular, it's about also cultural relevancy. You know, making sure that Black and brown youth in particular are seeing themselves as much as possible in the sport. And, you know, that'll take time at the professional level, but I think we're making inroads at the youth level. You know, and I think, you know, just continuing to really sort of understand the trends. I mean, we're steeped in data and we're marketing and just making sure that, you know, we are learning from what's in front of us, so that we're able to sort of stay a step ahead and continue to position ourselves. You know, our goal is to become the most inclusive sport in the world. And it's going to take time, but that is our goal. And so making sure that we are, you know, leveraging data and storytelling and all the components that you need, you know, we're steeping ourselves in those things.
Yeah, the responsibility and the need is enormous, and so I think the work will be continuing on and hopefully accelerated so that this is not the same conversation that's happening next year, 10 years from now, but we've seen progress. And I think also for us, it's, while we're of course focused externally on all of our partners, our programming and our grantee partners, it's also making sure that internally we're following the same ethos of collaboration and equity. And so even, you know, starting from our leadership with our CEO being a Black woman, like I mentioned, myself being a South Asian woman, right, showing that level of representation at the leadership, and that is exemplified in our hiring practices and things like that is really important, so that when young people that we are working with and supporting see this and see other organization leaders that look like them, they know that sport might be just an access point for so many other opportunities. And so I think looking at it and being able to provide that level of variety and access through this one point of sport is just so special, and what each of us can do in a unique way. And of course, just being in this room, right, seeing so many friends, so many partners, and being able to have these casual conversations that have had to be a scheduled Zoom, and then you have to re-click into the link because the 40 minutes are up. And so really just, you know, making sure that like we're taking this time and opportunity to come together and see how we can further accelerate all of the partnership and great work that I know we will be, and we have been accomplishing and will be accomplishing together.
The pandemic clearly exposed that there's a lot of work to do.
Right.
And while we were all affected in one way or the other, it didn't manifest the same in all communities. In Black and brown communities, you had a higher likelihood of dying, of being exposed, and not being able to connect to Wi-Fi, of having a parent lose their job, of being at risk of losing your home, of having food insecurity. All of those things were clearly disproportionately impacting communities of color. It couldn't have been a better way of, it really demonstrated the inequities that exist in our community, that existed way before the pandemic. And so the question is, so what do we do about it today? And I think that the work that lies ahead is really about being honest about how the systems that we've created are just not working, and not being afraid to slowly start dismantling them and imagining something else that is centered around the communities we are here to serve. And it takes a lot of courage to do that, and I really respect all the leaders who are here, who are within their own organizations and certainly within their own industry, really taking on issues that a generation ago wouldn't even considered. And so it's amazing to see how folks are coming to that realization. And so now really in many ways the real work is just beginning.
One thing I will add, if you don't mind, Debbie, just for a minute, is I want to just sort of put a punctuation on this, is representation matters. As we think about the work that we are going to do in communities of color, representation matters. It matters if you're going into a black and brown community that people look like them and reflect what they see in themselves. So I would just say to us that we really are culturally sensitive to that fact as we're going into communities. I will never forget, this was at an NHL All-Star in Las Vegas, and we're there announcing the street hockey program, and they invited a local organization of kids to come out to introduce them to street hockey, kids of color, girls and boys who'd never played the sport. And this one little girl walked up to me. She was all of 8 years old, African American, 3'8". She was a badass. She walked right up to me and goes, "Miss Angela, where do you work?" And I said, "I work at ESPN. Where do you work?" And so she kind of laughed and said, "Well, I'm not old enough to work." She said, "But you've inspired me because I see the possibility of myself
I
in
remember
you."
that.
And so I share that story to say representation matters. Please don't underestimate that when you're, thank you, when you are going into these communities of color, that you really think about how you're going to lead, not only from a programming, but the people that are going in and to lead on your behalf.
Yeah, that was a great day.
It was a great day. She
was
made
a
me
great
cry. She's my friend. We text each other. Just saying.
And,
You
and
know,
that's
I-
what success looks like, right? That's
Yeah.
the beginning of what success looks
Yeah,
like. when
that
you
small
see-
moment, right? You don't
Yeah.
know the difference it could make in somebody's life just to see somebody that looks like themselves.
I think people want to see themselves.
Yeah,
And
to
if
know
they
it's possible.
don't, they shut down.
Yep.
Yeah.
So I think that the great work that you guys are all doing, and we have one last question. I think we're almost out of time. But I think in every company, you literally have a lot of opportunities. So why do you do this work? I mean, you know, I know for me it was a passion, and obviously it seems like it's a passion here. But everybody's been tapped to say, come on, you need to move over here in this department. And so why do you do the work you do?
I've been doing this work from a corporate philanthropic standpoint for 25 years. But I was raised in knowing that it was my responsibility to give back. Both my parents were educators, elementary school teachers, who from the age of 6 years old, my mother would take my brother and I to make calls for the United Negro College Fund telethon back in the day when Lou Rawls hosted it. That's how old it was, right? To showing up, walking in walkathons for breast cancer, and we didn't know why she was waking us up so extremely early in the morning. But it was intrinsically bred into us to believe you have a responsibility to give back because so much has been given to you. So I've known that this was my passion from an early childhood, and I'm fortunate and blessed to be able to do this from a job perspective, having done this for the last 20-some years in my career.
I want to sort of think about what you said, how important it is that the communities see themselves in us. As important is that we see ourselves in them.
Absolutely.
And for me, you know, I feel very fortunate as I get paid to be myself. My life experience growing up with undocumented parents in Southeast LA County, you know, being the first one in my family to go to college, you know, being a young parent at 19, having to rely on public assistance to finish school. All of that is relevant, and in many ways more relevant than my degrees and my resume.
Yep.
And so to answer your question, I feel a sense of responsibility to harness that experience to change the outcomes for the community where I come from, and to do it not just for a moment or for a handful of people, but for generations.
Yep. You're done.
I love this work, and I'm so lucky I get to do it. And part of why I think all of us, when you come into work every morning, I get to work with an amazing team. I think that is like what drives me. The passion of the Los Angeles Dodgers Foundation, our whole, like all of my colleagues, they're just so amazing. And so that in and of itself is so inspiring to me. And so to do that work with a group of people that are like-minded, to share the values that want to impact the community in that way is just so special. And then also for me, I have a 7-year-old daughter, and I look at the world differently now. So I started this work at the foundation about 8 years ago. And so She is born and raised in Dodger Stadium, and in her mind, there is not a single thing that a woman cannot do. And I feel like that is just like, sorry, I keep hitting the most amazing thing. And so just for her to see that and to see the world through her eyes and just know that nothing is unavailable to her because of who she's seeing in different rooms is just really spectacular.
And I know we're over, but Brian, if you quickly, I know we're over just a little bit.
Yeah, real quick, it's the same for me. I've got two, I've always been passionate about this work, but I've got two young daughters, 11 and 6, very precocious, and they feel like there are no limits. And that's exactly what we're trying to create. And so they were a little upset that I had to come all the way out here because they're daddy's girls and they wanted to either come with me or for me to stay home. But I said, listen, I've got to help other people understand and share with people the good things we're doing at the NHL. And, you know, and we're trying to create a world where everybody has a fair shot and can be a part of something. And she says, oh, okay, well, that's okay, you can go. So that was my 6-year-old. So, you know, I want them to grow up in a world where not only they see positive female role models, but they also have a male role model that shows support and believes in them. So that's a big driving force.
Well, I want to thank you all for being here. Thank you, the audience, Renata, LA84, and your entire team for having us. And, you know, I think at the end of the day, we all want to create change. You know, it's impactful, it's meaningful, we have to do it. So thank you again, and thank you guys.